Gov is here.
All right, cool. I already have op speaking order. Can I get Gov speaking order in the chat as well? And while you guys are typing that out, what was the Gov veto?
So we had a coin toss.
Okay.
Gov vetoed motion. So both of us vetoed motion 1. Then we had the coin toss for the motion that we're going to be doing. So we're doing motion number 2.
Okay, great. Let me just key in the names into the ballot. Okay, cool. Everything is filled in. I don't think we have any observers in the room, but if we do, please don't do anything to distract the speakers during their speeches. Okay, all that out of the way, on the motion, this House regrets the normalization of the politics of outrage calling upon the Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, Nicole.
Okay, perfect. Let me just fix my papers for a sec. Right. POIs through chat, please. Let me be clear. On government, we do not regret outrage as a political tool. We agree that it can be quite important. What we regret, however, is how it has become the main tool used, whether it be by movements or politicians, to be able to forward their agendas, to be able to forward their beliefs. We think ultimately it is extremely self-destructive, both for the average citizen, but also for the very goals of these movements and of these people. Let's first frame what normalization and outrage looks like. So one, normalization means that it's the main tool used. So what we would suggest is that to some extent you block out people who are just less mad. And that's for the reason that if you agree that it's the main tool, that is often the main expectation. That perhaps the ideal way of expressing your dissent, expressing your disagreement, or expressing your agenda is through outrage. Second, a third, we would say that political outrage is generally uncompromisable. Because for you to be able to show that your stance is strong, to show that you are outraged entirely and this is something that cannot be changed, you have to position yourselves to be uncompromisable. Finally, outrage can happen whether it be within social movements, externally putting themselves out there, internally dealing or setting agendas, but also with politicians in trying to gain power, in trying to talk to their people or engage in debates. Finally, outrage generally looks like, probably on one level, language and tone used. So perhaps you're more angry. Perhaps you will turn to more ad hominem or more inflammatory language to piss off people. But we would say this also looks at a larger extent of things you're willing to do. And that means that some people, in expressing that outrage, are willing to go as far as violence, which opposition also has to defend. What, therefore, is a discourse we prefer? It's quite simple: a clear and calm stance. People who engage in that discourse by talking to each other, by debating in the manner at which we debate in as well, and just kind of talk about the benefits and harms of a policy, or actually discuss the lived experiences of people on the ground, as opposed to expressing that in anger. Finally, I want to preempt why we won't be a pushover. I think one, obviously people are still facing real problems. So whether it be the economy fucking them up or them facing discrimination, these are all real visceral things that people will want to have a stance in. So we can probably agree that it's the debate is not about whether or not they care, but rather how they express that care. But second, that many of these places, chat least, you are a particularly important voter base insofar as there are growing immigrant and growing POC populations, which means that at some point politicians have to listen to you. What I'm going to discuss to you is why at every step of normalization, outrage is bad and it becomes worse. And I want to frame that normalization is done whether it be between individuals within the same movement, but also externally in trying to fight for stuff to politicians. Clarify. Op cannot say it was extraneous because normalization came as a result of a chain of events. So what they have to prove and defend is why it was worth it at every step, whether it be violent or not. One, in some parts of the world and in some movements, there are people who just don't want to engage in outrage. And there are three reasons why. One, self-preservation instincts. They want to keep their families safe. They want to make sure their business aren't targeted. They want to make sure they can still go to work every day. So even if there is discrimination, oftentimes it's a trade-off they take and that they consent to for them to feel as if they can continue with their daily lives without getting any more losses. But second, that protests with outrage have a lot of unintended consequences. Things like you don't know if the police will come in and like fight you. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if there's going to be a stampede. And so most people gravitate towards more calm and controlled like environments. But finally, that outrage is very privileged. That you stop working, you mess up the economy, you have socio-political protections, and if you are harmed, you can afford medical care because these are all the sacrifices that are required to be made when you express outrage, and the average person cannot access that. The impact here is simple. One, people who do not want to conform to outrage are just probably forced to, insofar as that's the only way people view it to be valid. But second, that there's just social pressure around you, that if you do not do it, you're not good enough. But third, it's association, even if you're not forced to, because everyone else is in your community is engaging in it, and you probably look like them or what have you, you are also associated with that and might face the outright discrimination that comes as a result of this outrage. These are innocent people. These are bystanders who are harmed simply by the normalization of this outrage. Our comparative is simple. One, we would say that someone who would probably be more willing to someone who will engage in protest is now more willing to speak in such a manner that is no longer violent. So the average person who is afraid of being harmed in protest and in outrage is probably more likely to speak up in our side. But second, that outrage in our world is only used for big steps and therefore remains visceral to society. So for example, in historically putting in the first black politicians, which was done through outrage, was only really worked to that extent because it was used before the normalization. That is the extent of outrage that we defend. But finally, because we already have black politicians, for example, or people of color who are in power, people are more and more educated from these places and can therefore participate in that discourse. Second level, politicians don't take people who do outrage very seriously. And let's say that op gets some success. We would suggest it doesn't lead to like them being in the decision-making table. At best, you're able to just get people to realize this issue exists. But there are three key reasons why they don't get to talk in these little table talks. One, outrage is anti-establishment. You are not listening to the police. You are resisting basic laws of the land. And it's unclear why you get a seat at the table to talk about these policies. Two, parties just don't want to side with violence because it turns away the average voter. So even if the average voter cares about people of color, cares about women, etc., it's the point in which you make them feel as if they're threatened viscerally and physically that they're less likely to want to side with politicians who side with you. But finally, that it's just like it's harder to prop up someone that you can negotiate with as a movement because you are seen as uncompromising, because you are seen as angry, because you don't have a voice of reason in there. So if you have any current politicians who are minorities, you actually discredit them insofar as you put them in a place in which for them to either keep their voter base, they kind of have to either discredit you, or two, they keep quiet and they're just pigeonholed into this thing of being a bad politician coming from this group. Why is change therefore more likely to happen on our side? It's just that the policies are fought for, so you can do it successfully if you have statistics, you can present benefits, and people can actually hear what that is. But second, it's about getting picked up by larger parties, which is far more likely to happen if you are a voice of reason as opposed to a voice of outrage. Finally, then, what we would suggest is anger is irreversible and uncontrollable. All you can do as a movement or as a person or as a politician is stoke the fire, but you cannot stop the flame. So once you piss off someone to side with you don't know if they're going to do property damage. You cannot stop them from doing things like hurting other people, making other people feel like they're not good enough. And what that means is that outrage is unstrategic, but two, creates extreme harms to you as a person, with the people around you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the speech. Calling upon the leader of all. Hear him.
Hi, am I loud and clear? Okay.
Yep.
Get my order. Okay. Right. I'll start in 3, 2,
Right. Hello. I think you're frozen up. Can anyone else in the room just confirm that it's not my end alone?
Yeah, we can confirm.
Okay, good. We'll wait for her to come back and then she can restart her speech.
Oh, our Elo disconnected. She
Yeah.
is reconnecting as soon as possible.
Okay, no problem.
Hi, sorry. My Can I be clear? Hold on, let me just check.
Yeah, we can hear you clearly. If you don't want to click on your camera, that's fine.
Okay, great. Sorry. My laptop had a moment. Okay, sorry. I'll start from the top. Okay. Okay. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. When the first stone was cast in the Stonewall riots out of anger, it set off a chain of events that will lead to greater liberalization and greater rights for LGBTQ individuals. When we conduct pride riots later on, decades down the line, as a result of the normalization of the politics of outrage, people listen to them. People understand that it is a valid political tool because they know that it is something that they can do, that it is something that is justified for them given the historical oppression. Two important strategic observations about government bench. The first thing is, I think given in the This House Regrets motion, they are burdened to discuss why is this exactly the likely outcome of the outrage that they tell you. But then on the converse then, the question now that we want to posit to a government bench is how exactly is the calmness likely to stand out? What is the extent of effectivity given that they themselves know that there are systems of oppression that exist in status quo? We are going to posit to you later on in opposition why it is far difficult for minorities and the like to be able to continue to speak out in a world where the politics of outrage is not normalized, in a world where they are required to be calm. But then the second thing is they tell you that the access to outrage is far easier. We want to question this, right? Because we want to know that outrage stems from emotions that is inevitable for individuals, for minorities that are continually oppressed. It is inevitable for them to lash out. But then we posit then on the converse that it is untrue that calmness is far easier to access. We posit this actually harder because it is far difficult to be calm in a situation where you're continually oppressed by the state, where individuals, it is harder for you as well to access spaces, to get into the forums, or to get into the debates that so they shall speak of in a world where you're burdened to be calm. It is hard for these minorities to be calm in a world where they do not even have a seat at the table. We posit to you that the outrage culture doesn't create the divide. For example, as well, in the Me Too movement, women who are outraged did not bring down the movement who remained silent because they're well aware why members are afraid to speak up. At this point in time, it is unclear what is the extent of change of their comparative. What am I going to give in my PM speech? The first discussion on why the norm of outrage was necessary, and then the second thing is why the norm of outrage was effective. The first discussion on why it is necessary. There are three reasons to this. The first reason is that minorities get fucked over in status quo in the world out of anger because of things like historical state oppression, because of segregation and blacks and the whites, because of the crackdowns on LGBTQ individuals in the past. But the second reason as to why this is unnecessary, because it legitimizes anger as a valid form of political discourse. Because note, Aj, on either side of the debate, all movements do appear to be radical to the prevailing discourse and status quo. But then the question is, when movements become radical to push for political change, the question is, where exactly are you more likely to perceive the radicalism or the anger they have as a valid political tool and a valid response to the oppression they face? And here's how we flip government bench. Because sure, on government bench, they say you can't get visibility because these kinds of things are more likely to be saturated. But the problem with that discussion is that when outrage is present on both sides, on government bench, they're more likely to be called as not normal. They're more likely to be called crazy, irrational, violent, Marxist by the majority who are in power. Their ideas are more likely to be shut down. And this is why you don't get political discourse on their side, right? But then the third thing is that we posit it is necessary because in the past and in the ways that it's normalized, every other political tool hasn't worked. When the types of normalization of the politics of outrage is conducted in these types of spaces, awareness campaigns or things like calm discourse hasn't worked. For example, in the Black Lives Matter movement, even though we've tried to push for police change and crackdowns on police violence for years, it took the normalization of outrage with regards to that particular field when George Floyd was killed to be able to get like secessions and to be able to get changes in the police force. What are the impacts of this argumentation? The first thing, it is justified. The normalization of outrage is justified out of oppression. Otherwise, a government bench would have them stay in the dark and say these minorities unable to voice out their concerns. It highlights the oppressions these communities face, and this norm was necessary to be able to upend and call out the problems in the social institutions that they otherwise would not have had in a world where calm political discourse is the norm. I'll take a POI.
So the normalization of this suggests it happens on either side. Do you therefore support Trump's public mudslinging of immigrants and POCs?
We think that general discussion is something that is a cherry-picking example because we know that on either side of the debate, there will be some sort of things like the politics of outrage, right? But then also, even in the worst cases of populism, it has also enabled these individuals to be able to speak up about the issues that they face. So even if you have things like the norm of when Trump does things like mudslings at POCs, it is the ability of liberals and Democrats to create a counterculture, to create a counter reaction that would otherwise be put down on your side, but something that is empowered on our side. The second discussion then on why is the norm of outrage effective, right? There are three reasons as to why this is the case. The first thing, that it is very much clearly tantamount to extreme emotion. People are likely to listen to you when you are mad, when you say like extremely angered words on social media, or when you give an empowering speech as to why you feel slighted by these sorts of things. Even if it is bad publicity, as what government says, any publicity is good publicity. It is going to be picked up by the news, by social media. It is entering the political spaces. It will enter discourse into academia, where it is considered as something that is a political tool. But then the second thing is you're able to unravel internalized oppression, right? Because, for example, in the times in which the Stonewall riots occurred, or in the times in segregation, there is some individuals, even those minorities oppressed, believe that they ought to be oppressed or believe that they cannot change the world that they live in. On our side, when we tell you that the politics of outrage is normalized, we tell you that it's easier when it happens to a great extent, it is easier for minorities to believe that they deserve to be mad, that they deserve to call for better things, as opposed to in a world where they are forced to stay calm even when their heart tells them not to. We get the critical mass for social change. But then the third thing, even on our worst case, outrage culture is temporary. Because with normalization of politics of outrage culture in a particular area, even on our worst case, does stop when the issue is addressed. In the process, though, it is exposed to media, legislation, lobbying. The BLM movement was effective even after the violent riots and the death of George Floyd, because it got police reform in areas not even in the area where George Floyd died. In comparison, on government, outrage and calm will be both present as tools only to those in power. What does this look like, right? When you are calm on government bench, a majority or white individuals have the ability to be able to overtake these spaces and be like, why is this true? Three important reasons why. The first thing is that they rule the dominative narrative of political discourse. They were already there far before the minorities. But then the second thing is pre-existing racial biases. But the third thing is structural advantages in the way that they're able to access higher education or wealth. And this is why debating is a terrible example, because in debating, we still have a lot of structural biases against EFL and ESL speakers. At the end of the day, the comparative on government is they do not have an ability to speak out because it is not normalized, because they're going to be seen as crazy radicals. For all these reasons, never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you, Ellen, for the speech. Coming upon the DPN. Again.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, the vote.
Okay. For POIs, people can POI me however you want to. Just don't dodge it. I'll make sure to take a POI for my speech.
Clarify, POI through voice, POI through chat.
Any is fine.
Thank you.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate assumes that some level of buy-in towards movements is required, given the unique messaging that movements have towards a certain base of individuals, towards a certain sect of the population. Therefore, this debate is a question of whether or not we get more buy-in given we have more outrage or we have more peaceful protests on the other side of the house. This debate does not necessarily necessitate a trade-off, because we can also have outrages to some degree on the other side of the house, but you'd prefer more peaceful protests. But they cannot also claim from opposition that they want less outrages or will stop outrages to an extent when it's already done over, it's going to be temporary, necessarily because that also skirts their own burden, the point at which they also consider that outrages are not always the most effective tool within the toolbox they're able to use. There are 3 things I'll talk about. The first is, where do we get more people to listen? The second is, where do we increase buy-in? And the third is, where do we get more political change? The first thing I want to answer is the direct rebuttal from leader of opposition, into which they claim that we have no counterfactual. We were very clear from first speaker what our counterfactual was about how policymaking takes place. This occurs in there's 3 levels. The first is they're more willing to listen to us, the point which they're not disenfranchising the lead. That's the reason as to why Rishi Sunak was able to win as prime minister in the UK, as well as Ireland being able to have good talks in the UK, necessarily because violence was not a tool in the toolbox. They able to unite both sides of the house. But the second is, when you're seen as the enemy, they are less likely to listen to you. This is the reason as to why the Yellow Jacket protests in France did not necessarily get their oil subsidies or their agricultural subsidies, the point at which Macron easily cracked down upon them as terrorists and violent protesters. This is also the reason as to why you got massive housing and infrastructure damages within Cyprus, the point which the enfranchised elite are unlikely to listen to you, the point which you become the point which you are seen as more radical. And I want to know, the leader of opposition necessarily concedes to this when they say that right now movements are already seen as radical, therefore we should double down on that radicalism. I think that's just a false comparative, right? The point which you double down on that comparative, you become far worse, because it only justifies the idea of the elite and the enfranchised that they are necessarily worse off individuals you try to cater towards minorities. But why are we more likely to be picked up? We told you a couple of reasons. The first is because you are seen as more palatable. This is the reason as to why the Serbia Against Violence coalition against Alexander Vucic necessarily won, is necessarily because they were seen as more palatable towards the voter base. This is the reason as to why the Law and Justice Party in Poland also won, disenfranchising Donald Tusk for the longest possible time, because they were seen as a palatable opposition towards the vast majority of individuals within society. But here's how we engage with their best case scenario. Under both sides, people will listen to the movement because of a unique fundamental or foundational stance. This is the operational frame for both sides of the debate. The question is the extent of benefits which we're able to accrue, which you only get if we provide because we don't provide active disincentives for parties not to listen to us. So one, we get less opposition because we are more palatable and parties not constitutionally see us as just radical. But second, the important delta is also because this perception is how we're necessarily able to get more buy-in when people are likely to engage with us more, the point which they see that we aren't as radical as you point out to be. So that's the reason as to why our counterfactual necessarily works. They were unresponsive. You had no response towards the multiple structural reasons you gave to earlier. But second, they then said, historical oppression. And I want to note, this is where the counterfactual we had earlier was very, very clear. Because the first few times outrage was used was effective necessarily because it was not normalized. People were new to the idea of it. People saw it as novel. The point that it becomes more normalized and people see it over and over again, it becomes less applicable towards fighting for minorities overall. The last and final thing that they say is that Things like George Floyd, for example, this is how we're able to help the BLM movement. And in a response to my prime minister's POI, they said, we don't need to defend Trump because Trump is like an uncharitable example. I would know that Trump is probably the most charitable example, necessarily because that's how populist leaders are necessarily able to gain more followers, the point at which they use outrage. And that's the same reason as to why Rodrigo Duterte was able to win the Philippines, necessarily because he used the outrage against a drug war to galvanize the vast majority of individuals against the enfranchised Liberal Party elite. That's the reason why they're far worse off when they prop up populist leaders who oftentimes use their cult of personalities to be able to outrage the movement and necessarily get levels of change within society. But that level of change is necessarily harmful because oftentimes, even if they're successful, it is controlled by a cult of individuals within that movement, or it's controlled by a one-man power within that movement. That's the reason as to why they're unlikely to win. But I want to note another example to also counter their own idea. Because the reason as to why we reformed the police, the reason as to why people actually listen to the BLM movement or the LGBT movement, and most importantly, the reason why Biden won in 2020 was not because he had a campaign of outrage, but necessarily because he was calmer towards the vast majority of individuals. He was much more palatable to the elite, and therefore was able to get more lobbying power. That's the reason as to why our comparative is far, far more believable, even if you don't buy, we get the full extent for benefits. Before I move on, POI.
So, KL, do you think every woman who gets angry about sexual harassment no longer matters?
No, I think every woman does get angry. The question is whether or not we want that to be the face of the movement, because I do agree that individuals are able to express themselves. The problem is that the point at which you use that as the central piece of the movement becomes far harder for you to be able to necessarily win, necessarily get more individuals, because you are seen as a radical movement and are unhelpful overall. But even if you don't buy that response, we told you earlier as well as to why you propping up populist leaders or you necessarily controlling the agenda of the movement to always be outrageous is necessarily harmful. And that's the next section we want to bring to you about how you harm people within the movement who are not as outraged or radical. And this engages to their best case scenario where they get massive buy-in under their side of the house. How does this harm the opt-in? Because individuals opt into the movement on a fundamental stage when they don't always believe that the movement will always be violent. Because if they'll always be violent to begin with, you have less buy-in, obviously. The problem is that oftentimes you paint a facade of the movement, that it's going to be nice, it's going to be like to some degree not always violent, or it won't always step into your life. The problem is that when you present this facade, it necessarily misleads individuals because they don't fully consent to all the violence and all the radicalism when that movement to begin with. But here's the even if you know that there is some tendency to violence in the movement, you may not want it for various reasons. So we told you earlier, like it's not applicable, or you have to vote your work on a day-to-day paycheck. But what happens to the comparative is that you're forced into the movement and get attacked because the idea is that the entire movement is radical. So yes, this is how we respond to POI, right? Maybe some women in the feminist movement are radical, but some feminists are also not radical. The problem is that you necessarily harm those individuals who are not radical in the same lump within the entire movement overall. That's the reason as to why Balkans and Serbia were necessarily harmed against, even though the vast majority of the population did not engage in the manslaughter in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's the reason as to why the vast majority of individuals are also harmed within these scenarios. That's the problem, is that because by pure association towards the movement, you are disenfranchised and you are far worse off overall. That's how you reduce buy-in in the long term. Because even if you get some buy-in under the side of opposition right now, it reduces the long term, the point that people don't see the active benefits and are always painted as the evil individual winning that. But here's the important weighing. If you buy the best case of opposition, there are many strong movements that utilize outrage well. This actually decreases the scale of effectivity of protests. Number one, because we told you why people are used to it, so say non-starter in discussions. But number two, the state also knows how to respond better to like water cannons, tear gas, and police forces, for example. But the third is, at best, they get the state to give some tokenistic concessions to make them shut up, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem under their side of the house. I want to know that this responds to the opposition case because in their best case scenario, you are able to get some level of buy-in and some level of benefits. They're still far worse off towards the long term of the movement. That's why they make it far harder for people to get any actual structural change in the long term proposed.
Thank you, DPM, for the speech. Calling upon the DLO. Here.
Can you hear me and see me?
Yep. Yes, you
Yeah, so take POIs through voice. Yeah, that's all. Starting my speech in 3,
2, 1. Government's main points are latent effects which we can mitigate. Do not forget the great strides that we have made to create social justice and made lives better for the vast majority of minorities. So while we do agree that to some extent the system is not perfect, it has done a lot of good in the world. And a lot of the harms that they say are things that eventually fall off or do not matter or something that can be mitigated. We have talked about George Floyd's murderer and the clamor for justice and how the outrage that the Black Lives Movement has caused has pressured courts to be more accountable, giving his oppressor life imprisonment. We have talked about Rosa Parks and the ability for her to stand up and say, I do not want to sit at the back of the bus anymore, actively making sure that the white individuals there are going to secede to whatever she wants. All of these things point that to begin with, we needed the ability for social movements to be visibilized before we can capacitate them to engage in calm discussions. And that is the chicken and egg discussion, which I'm going to deal with in my first issue on where do we get better buy-in. This is a deeply critical issue because government asserts that the reason why discussions on their calmness are going to be effective already assumes that people and minorities have the capacity to actually believe that they are not to believe that they are oppressed and therefore they must do something about it, about the internalized oppression point that Tara talked about. Let's discuss that. The first thing they say is policies are going to be fought for and picked up by larger parties. People are more likely to speak up and they're likely to get big benefits off on their side because then there's just less opposition to it, etc. One, we need to discuss the state before we made outrage the norm. That is, people in power, the majority, are white rich conservatives in seats of power who make decisions, making social movements extremely invisible. One, because a lot of these Black individuals or like people in minorities do not have seats in power. In fact, there are very few. Two, because they actively face daily problems like racism or sexism, for example. And three, like for example, LGBT communities were actively jeered and oppressed on the streets. Why are these all likely? One, because the majoritarian view was culturally followed and was the norm. Second, that people in power actively had the incentive to keep these groups oppressed, either because they did not know these problems or it was just much easier to choose to ignore these problems. And three, they have the capacity through the money and power that they have. Why is this proof extremely critical for the debate that they want to fight? It proves that their counterfactual is not solvent at all because on their side, you make these problems further invisible and therefore make it easier to ignore. And that is why outrage needed to be normalized because you make these problems visible. You make these problems hard to ignore because of the extreme emotion that these minorities say that we need to get up, stand up, and stop agree to this bullshit. So this heavily deals with DPM and PM for several reasons. First is, sure, policies will be fought for, but they're more likely to be ignored because you do not shift the Overton window. That is, these minorities are still seen as highly radical on their side and extremely unreasonable anyway, therefore mitigating the point that we will be seen as radical because at the very least, when we are radical under our side of the house, we gain more allies to the same extent that we also gain more enemies. So yes, people will always demonize us on either side of the house. But the question is, where do we make our problems more visible such that we could capture the middle and more moderate demographic to believe that we are oppressed and that they must go against the establishment? And that is why outrage needed to be normalized. Second, they say that it will be picked up by larger parties. Why? It's unlikely because if I were a white politician comfortable in my ivory tower, I do not have any incentive at all to cater to a Black individual. I have no idea why this is reasonable. But third, they say that they are more likely to speak up. We say that this is unlikely at the point at which like to the fact that people were okay and socialized to believe that their oppression is something that is normal and okay for them to live in. So we say that the normalization and the process over the past decades was necessary because we tell them that they need to fight against their oppression. Therefore, this goes on to the next response on they say that people will either get pressured or associated and therefore will get harmed. So they state that the normalization is bad because generally people don't want to engage in outrage. There's things like self-preservation and unintended consequences that lead to innocent people or bystanders being either pressured to go with it or second to be associated with it. Why is this untrue? Because while we do agree that outrage encourages people to express their outrage, we say that what the normalization uniquely has done is to express this outrage in the way that they want to. Because historically, they've been fucked over and sick of racism, because they saw their family, their brothers oppressed in the eyes of the unequal system. This overrides the self-preservation mechanism that they want to fight for, because the ability for them to say, I want to express this outrage through social media is a valid form of like outrage as well. In the same way that if you want to protest, if that's how you want to express your anger, then that is equally valid. Both forms are valid because it makes more and more people notice and therefore create critical mass to buy into this movement, because you visibilize them, and people are obviously want to support these people because they have realized that they have been far too oppressed and that they're deeply unequal in the eyes of the law. So there's no pressure. There is association, but it's only to extents. So we win this issue because we get better buy-in. They get no solvency under their side of the house. They don't even explain and give me persuasive reasons to prove why this discussion of theirs will visibilize them to begin with. No, thank you. I'm going to therefore. Oh, actually, go. Okay, I'll go.
You can frame that outrage is important to get people to notice, because your L already concedes that people already know groups are radical. Therefore, this is an uncharitable frame.
No. So on either side, both sides will be radical, because we're talking about the majority-minority framework, right? On your side, there's still going to be the majority-minority framework. The difference is, at the very least, under our side, we have more incentives on our side and capacity to actually make people realize oppression occurs. It's not a inconsistency. The last thing are just Trump, like the example of Trump, is not applicable and ineffective. The first reason is, in as much as, yes, we voted Trump and populist leaders in, number one, this populism is not inherently a bad thing because it is a vote of the people, and if that's what democracy wants, then so be it. But second, even if you do not believe that, the normalization of outrage was extremely necessary because it formed counter cultures and counter responses to the conservative majority. So the bad actions of Trump were not the end point, because the liberals eventually wanted to continue to have outrage and say we don't want Trump's policies and create better negotiations, because each group now has the incentive to actually give a shit about what the other side is fighting for, and saying why each side is wrong, and therefore creates negotiation as to what type of world, what type of immigration policies we eventually want to have. So we win that. Under your side, populism is still likely to occur. The difference is with the extent to which we deal with populism. Panel, we are clearly winning this debate because you have to consider the chicken and egg problem that government proceeded with. You need to first believe that you are oppressed and you need to fight for your rights before you are able to engage in more calm discussions. People can pick and choose how they want to express their oppression. I'm very proud to folks.
Thank you, Diallo, for that speech. Calling upon the government. Yeah.
Hello, am I audible? Is this fine?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I want to be clear. Opposition is not debating for the normalization of outrage. They're just debating why outrage ought to be a political tool, which you already support. Look at their analysis from first speaker. Violence is used as a last resort. Surely if it is normalized, surely if a lot of people doing it, surely if you, for example, see that it's the main form of political discourse, it will not be a last resort. They give reasons for effectiveness, like extreme emotion, but they do not prove as to why these reasons will persevere if it is normalized. We tell you that the problem is that maybe it will succeed the first few times, but as it goes on, people will just think that you're just being angry for no reason. You're not actually fighting for anything, which is why you get the tokenistic policies, or the absolute worst case, you pop up a strong politician to crack down on this dissent because you're tired of people constantly rioting and you want to prioritize your own safety as an average citizen. That is the case, and that is the difference between both sides, and that is why they lose. I want to deal directly with what are the implications of this. The first thing is that if we concede that it is normalized, then their side is normalized, then it is a lot of people doing it, and majority of social movements are doing it. That's something they have to support. But secondly, we do have the initial outrage before the normalization. So when you talk about, for example, the Black Panthers or the Stonewall riots, that all happened before it was normalized. So this probably exists under our side as well. That means we already have people in politics. We already have people that already recognize that there is a problem. We already have social movements and mobilization that exists to a great extent. And they have to concede to this because for example, outrage doesn't just appear out of nowhere. You need a baseline movement, which is probably a symmetric characterization on both sides. Secondly, they accuse us of cherry picking examples. Here's the truth. This is a team that only talks about the US. But guess what? In the US, this is not where the biggest form of normalization of outrage happens. It happens in Cyprus, where people, for example, trash independent media organizations. It happens, for example, in Eastern Europe or in India, where yes, women have the right to be mad, but they beat up men, and that increases domestic abuse nationally. I'm unsure as to why this ought to be justified, as to why this ought to be supported. Under their side, they have the cherry-picked examples. We talk about the vast majority of cases, there's no engagement. What is the most important issue? I want to be very clear. It is not social change. And this team gives no reason as to why it is social change. They give you a couple of sob stories instead of actual analysis. Here's the reason why our first argument, and our first layer in particular, about safety ought to be the most important. One, risk is only acceptable if people consent to it. You are subjecting innocent minorities to the same violence that you are inherently opposing. The moment that you have that association, the moment that you, for example, make them victims of red tagging when they just want to care for their family, and that is an important priority for them. But the second thing is that you open them to a lot more discrimination. It harms other people like their family. It harms, for example, other people of your community that would have otherwise been moderate or otherwise would have been political, but now are disenfranchised because they feel voices in a community that ought to prioritize violence. Why is this important, by the way? We're not saying majority of people are like this. The fact that there is some people are important because you're subjecting them to harms that they have not consented to. The point of social change is to have consensus across society and try to fight for something. So risk is only acceptable when you have the priority of consent. But let's say you do have consent. I actually argue it's still unjustified for the reason of uncertainty. Here's the truth. Social change is never guaranteed. Every movement you have is a gamble, but safety and normalcy is. This is why it's important for movements, because you fight for the welfare of your movement, so you cannot trade their welfare for any speculative benefit of certainty, because the prerequisite for your legitimacy and existence of a movement was on the welfare of your people. They want to respond that people deserve to be mad. Yes, you are, but people have other rights to not be mad or to just live a normal life, and you are taking that away from them. I'm unsure as to why your right to be mad overtakes theirs, but in fact it probably isn't, because it's self-expression versus a tangible harm against other individuals. Society, we agree that expression is not absolute, especially if it comes to a tangible harm. But the second thing, and this is important, you do have alternatives. You have peaceful protests, you have mobilizations. They want to talk about the BLM. MLK was more important than Black Panthers. They want to talk about women's rights. The most important recent march was peaceful in 2015 against Trump. I'm unsure as to why you don't get that mobilization. They say that people override self-preservation at the previous speaker. One, we gave 3 reasons. But secondly, they don't actually respond to it. They say there are extents of association. No, you didn't listen to the previous speaker. We talked about red tagging. We talked about retaliation. We talked about how discrimination is lazy. People, like, if you look like someone who is Black and they have an experience of someone who is Black, for example, robbing them, you make that association inherently, because discrimination is not specialized, it is lazy. On the effectiveness issue, I'll take a point now if there are any. Okay, effectiveness issue. All claims that calm is exclusive. One, and the analysis here is wrong, right? They're saying that the white have overtaken the spaces where you speak. No, you have never owned those spaces in the first place. The majority already have those spaces. And the reason why this characterization is important is because it's not about them taking it from you. It is about you entering these spaces. You need to play their game, talk their language, because they do own it. Why is this important? Because ELO concedes that there are existing racial biases. So that's where the difference exists between both sides. Because under our side, we correct it. The narrative is that people are tribalistic, that they're uncompromisable, that they are radical, that they're like animals. On our side, when you have a politician that's able to voice out policy and agree and compromise, you correct those biases. On their side, they embolden it. You have the confirmation biases that these people are always radical and therefore justifies the oppression that they're in. The second thing is that even if we assume that it is somewhat exclusive, that is okay. Why? It's better to have less people, but make substantive change in policy. We give you reasons why you'll never have a seat in the first place, and crucially, we allow upcoming politicians to take control. I'll deal with the responses in a bit. But what did we give you that is unresponded to? And this is really important. This is a prerequisite and basis for all movements. or you cannot control the agenda of the movement. You cannot strategically mobilize because you cannot control your people once they are angry. You cannot control what they break and what do they not. You cannot reverse the moment you decide to be violent and the other time you want to be compromisable. Why is this important? Because it is the prerequisite for any meaningful policy to even know what you're fighting for, to have direction in terms of the mobilization that you have. They don't have that on a first premise level, so already a lot of their benefits are speculative. The second thing they try to do is talk about palatability. Firstly, in the previous speaker, they tried to say you gain allies, but you gain enemies. How do you gain allies? Here's the important thing, that in fighting within minority groups exists. Fighting against other different minority groups exists. The important thing is that almost universally, we think that violence is bad. So I'm unsure as to how you're able to get allies in the first place if people want to naturally disassociate from you for the reasons we give at first speaker that have no response. They try to say that all movements are radical, so this doesn't make a difference. No, but it's about the extent, how people respond to you. You ought to, for example, have a strongman leader because they're the only way to respond to an overwhelmingly violent minority demographic. But the second thing is that they try to question our mechanism at the last end of their speech. They say, why would white politicians want to pick them up? Firstly, the important thing is that there is a rising population. But secondly, obviously, if you're underserved, you are a huge demographic that is growing by day that other parties are able to capture. But also, if you have, for example, a compromisable politician, it's a lot easier for parties to convince other members to try to take up that person. So obviously, it's about extent, but we get it a lot clearer. So for all of those reasons, we urge you to propose.
Thank you, Gabriel, for the speech. Following on the offer. Here.
Right. POS your voice. I won't be checking chat. Okay. I am audible. I'm assuming I am audible. I got my voice recording. Okay. Starting in I want to first clarify the timeline that exists in this debate. Because given it's a disaster gets to normalization debate, it means that right now, outrage is normalized. Which means that we can claim that every victory that happened from the social movements as of right now are things that happened because of this normalized outrage. That's the reason why we provided these examples in which outrage, the normalization of outrage specifically, was what allowed us to attain these victories. Desher already gives a very compelling analysis about how when outrage was first used, this is where people were perceived as radical. But at the same time, these social movements were already radical in the first place, insofar as they constantly challenged the majority in the North themselves. I think either way, no one is going to win the debate on radicalism. Because so long as you try to change the status quo and try to vilify the most privileged people in power who continue to oppress you, who continue to violate you, and who continue to diminish your human being and rights, you will always be perceived as radical. The debate is not about whether or not we can make movements less radical because movements are already antagonized by the majoritarians and by the privileged. The difference then becomes is how exactly do we capacitate and better empower individual members that exist in the movement? But secondly, the discussion about buy-in is quite lost. And this is where I want to clarify it. Because Riva was trying to say that this is where you're going to have average voters not opt into the movement, not even perceive it to be something that is worth lobbying for because they are just violent in nature. One, I think we have to consider then that at the point in which your movement has already gone to outrage, in which you have opted into things like violence, even if it's a normalized thing, even if it's the first thing that you opt into as a political tool, it is surmounted or sourced from the amount of fatigue and desperation that you have because all other forms of protest, all other forms of change were never effective in the first place. And that is the same reason why government tries to protect these other political tools that are ineffective because they do not want change for these social movements in the first place. You have awareness campaigns, you have calm public discourse. Those things never matter to these social minorities. It doesn't matter to the POCs, to the white, to the women who were oppressed and raped and were violated for rights. Because every time that you bring the discussion, that they brought up the discussion, even with just calm, what ends up happening is that they get victim blamed. What ends up happening is that they end up getting racially profiled, that they are perceived as too radical. This is where I'm going to talk about the issue about whether or not on their discussion about policy and the idea of how we just lose the shock value and therefore outrage becomes ineffective. Firstly, this discussion about how they get the policy changes in the first place. One, this is not true. There's no likelihood analysis that comes out from either of their constructive speakers. At best, you have it as a weighing metric that comes from Riva. But secondly, assumes that a lot of the majoritarians are benevolent in nature. Because in order for you to get policy and the political discourse impacts that they wanted in the first place, you need to also build up the incentive analysis for politicians, conservatives, to also be pro-lobbying for things like affirmative action, or things like gender diversity quotas that exist on their side, or even safe spaces acts and social welfare, which by the way, a lot of conservatives still don't like, who also remain in power. I'm sure with the incentive changes, when they also build up the idea that stereotypes exist on their side, the idea that a lot of the majority are already against the minorities. So I'm not sure how exactly the likelihood for what the margin of change is when historically we've had calm discussions, yet it was not enough, yet we still had no changes. That's the reason why we normalized outrage. That's the reason why when the Me Too movement started to come out, that was where we started the normalization of outrage, especially, right? Where we started to see more women getting mad about sexual harassment, more women are getting mad about rape. We did not diminish the women who ended up becoming quiet and who did not speak about their experiences, because it is the same women, the same members of the movement that understand why exactly others feel silent. And this breaks up the discussion and logic that they posit that, oh, when you don't opt into outrage, you are suddenly isolated from the movement that protects you. Because that's not true. Because a lot of people, especially in the Me Too movement, especially in the BLM movement, understand the gravity of why people don't choose outrage. But at the same time, that is all the more reason why they need to be violent, all the more reason why they need to be louder and angrier, because they need to speak up for the voices that literally are oppressed and silenced by the existing social structures and pressures that chain them towards their oppression. Ultimately, when you look out, at the worst case where we don't get social change, one, at the very least, we are able to tell you that minorities are empowered in and of themselves if we have broad-based change occurring. But secondly, I think this is where they get more catharsis and more seen in the world versus where they are still oppressed and don't have the means to voice out their oppressions. Secondly, logic about normalizing anger leads to more irrelevant movements or the movement losing its relevance. One, this is not true. People who opt in are already angry with the status quo already, who have already been hurt. It was the normalized outrage that combated victim blaming culture of rape victims. It was the normalized outrage and violent protests from the Gulabi gang or from the BLM that stopped things like domestic violence and abuse in smaller communities in India. It was in the point in which we had the violent protests post George Floyd, where it allowed more scrutiny towards the public justice system, and that's where we started to prosecute more police brutality cases of white policemen. You have to understand, even at the point in which you lose your shock value, even at the point in which this becomes normalized, it does not change its effectivity. Because what ends up happening is you don't make these minorities visible, you're invisible, you don't make them silent, and it becomes a valid form of them being able to express the desperation that they had in their hearts. But secondly, this idea about how this exacerbates the crackdown of minorities. I think either way, minorities will be cracked down regardless, because so long as they are perceived as radical, so long as they're perceived as someone that is different from the majoritarian, like there is no incentive to not stop cracking down minorities. The difference then becomes is how we ought to react to it and how exactly we fight back. I don't think we can fight back things like state violence or crackdown if we just remain silent, if we just try to chalk it out. Because in the first place, these white people, these oppressors never attempted to talk us out. They ended up trying to oppress us further, creating segregation laws, trying to further brutalize the minorities that exist. I think radicalism is not the point in which we win this debate. But what we do win on is what are the options and tools that are effective, that are valid forms in order to opt into. So long as you don't normalize outrage, this is where you specifically call out minorities and say that whatever they do, it is bad. I think minorities will always be perceived as radical. The difference then becomes what is the tools that we can use to vet out these frustrations. Thanks.
Thank you all for the speech. Calling upon the public reply. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll start in 3. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Government bench in this debate is only effective if people will buy into their calm discussions. How, if these social structures were already against them to begin with? I will structure the speech in 2 layers. The first thing is I'm going to discuss on exactly where do we get better buy-in, and 2, we're going to talk about the worst case. This government bench given this debate with regards to where do we get better buy-in. They say that outrage means that individuals are less likely to listen to you, that it is exclusionary, that it is antagonizing. In comparison, calmness is seen as palatable, seen as playing in these spaces or playing the game that the white majoritarians play. Why then is this bad for 2 reasons? And how did we resolve this in the debate? The first thing is I'm going to paint you a picture of how exactly opposition bench resolved the deadlock, right? Because there's a pending question here on whether or not will you be seen as crazy still or when you're calm because of the radicalism of the stance that you take, or when you're calm, will you be seen as playing the game that these majoritarians play in the same way that government rep tries to tell us? Why then does you have to break this deadlock in favor of opposition? The first thing is that any stance that you take, whether even if you are calm, because you come from a position of minority and you're trying to actively challenge the structures of the majority, will be seen as radical in the same way that the Supreme Court justices who helped overturn the Brown versus Board of Education were seen as radical individuals and were seen as something that actively was a threat to the majority. But then the second thing is that biases are strong, is that the majority will always find a reason to discriminate you. Government whip tells you that these spaces are owned by the majoritarians in the first place, and therefore you have to enter them. But even when you enter them, they will find a way to discriminate you at every turn. When you are a woman in power, they would tell you that you slept your way to the top. When you're a POC and a business owner, they say perhaps maybe you're the diversity hire, or maybe it was just pure dumb luck. They never chalk it up to your ability to be able to access, and they will like disregard and disenfranchise you. This is the main case coming from opposition bench. But then the second thing I want to talk about, right, is on the worst case, right? And here's where we prove to you the silver bullet that kills opposition's bench because of the prerequisiteness of our kills government bench because of the prerequisiteness of our argument. Because let's take on opposition's worst case, right? Um, sure, maybe we may not get social change to the great extent as what government says on our worst case. But at the very least, we have one, minorities feel empowered in themselves, regardless if you get broad-based change happens. But 2, they're also able to get catharsis and are more seen compared to a world where they are oppressed, but they don't have the means to be able to voice out oppression. Our worst case on our side is the capacity of minorities in unraveling that internalized oppression, which is a prerequisite to minorities speaking up or getting the confidence to be able to penetrate the spaces that a government bench says that is owned by the majoritarians. Compare this to the worst case of government bench. The worst case is maybe calmness doesn't work, but at the very least, we don't have populism, we don't have inflammatory like public discourse. But the problem with that particular worst case is that minorities in their world are left behind. They're left behind with nothing because the majoritarians, even when they enter these spaces, they will find a way to disenfranchise them at every turn. At the end of the day, why do you have to believe opposition bench? We have to believe opposition bench because we prove to you that we are prerequisite. We provide the capacity and the incentive for them to be able to believe and for minorities to be able to speak up, to give them a share at the table where it is needed for them to be able to enact social change. For all these reasons, oppose.
Thank you all for replying to the speech. Calling upon Gov reply. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, the book.
Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition's silver bullet only works if you believe the context to work within the United States. We told you why our case operates in the vast majority of instances, also in the United States, but also in places like Serbia, Eastern Europe, India, France, and Cyprus. And this is crucial because this is why we told you as to why, even if they get social change, safety was an utmost priority to be able to increase the amount of buy-in and get long-term support for the movement to build support in the long term. There are two important weighing issues I'll weigh on. The first is, where do we get social change? And the second is, where do we increase safety for individuals within the movement? Let's first talk about social change. Because on opposition, they said was that outrage and anger equals getting listened to. And if you go through all the fluff in their material, this was the analysis that they told you from first down to last speaker that they never gave further justification for. And that was the reason as to why they're out to be an overwhelming norm. They then claimed this was important in their last line of defense because it was to establish a counterculture. I want you to recheck their notes because this non-value adding, because if their LO from the start concedes that these movements are already viewed as radical by the vast majority of society, which means it is already established as a counterculture, there's no need to further enfranchise it as a counterculture. The point is the vast majority already sees it in such a light. So there's no justification why there has to be a greater degree or greater extent of counterculture. Notice, we posited you this first question as a preemption from PM. Why does there have to be a greater extent? They never answered it from all three speakers. So, if there's no response to the radical becoming more radical, that is harmful because they're then seen as more outrage if society already believes right now that they are radical. We were very clear down the bench as to why we get these benefits. And this was likelihood analysis we gave you from first, second, and third, which by the way, they never responded to. One, we were seen as more palatable because you don't look as anti-establishment. This is how we're necessarily able to aggrandise the elite. But second is we also get less outrage, which is good because there's more support, which means we have greater impact overall, necessarily because we aren't always targeted by the police. The state isn't always ready to crack down on us. But the third and most important is that we are also likely to be picked up by the political party. And the incentive we brought you here that was never responded to was that if the movement is as unique as opposition claims it to be, then there's a selling point to a certain voting demographic that the party is able to pick up toward that movement, which is why the party will pick up under our side when they are seen as palatable to some degree and can be molded within the party. You remove these incentives in opposition when you make them seem as unpalatable and uncompromising, which by the way is their best case to get listened to under their side. So yes, maybe movements are inherently radical. The question from first that we told you is to why they have to be to such a large extent. The timeline problem, which they knew framed by opposition, actually harms their case. Because the violent movements were so radical at the start, it increases the likelihood of our response being that they are oversaturated and unlikely to be listened to. And here's the weighing for this. Their case is non-comparative and non-value adding, meaning even if you don't buy social change happen under our side of the house, we at least don't increase the harm towards the movement under proposition, which is the second claim we brought you. Why is safety the most important? Because we told you as to why it's a prerequisite to get buy-in to the movement. Under proposition, we brought you 3 independent structural reasons why safety is important. One, because it's only necessarily acceptable if people consent to this kind of safety to begin with, consent to the movement not being radical. Number 2, we told you that self-expression is not absolute because it leads to things like populism, for example. But third is that, in principle, even if you support the movement's ideologies, they never answer as to why it has to be the banner and headline statement of the movement to the greatest degree. So yes, you have self-expression under opposition, but they had no response as to why it has to be the overwhelming norm within this movement overall, which they could have responded to op whip and op reply, but never did so. So self-expression happens under our side, but there's no justification as to why it necessarily, but we told you as to why it should not necessarily be the norm because of the overwhelming harm that happens. And this is the most important thing to weigh in the debate, because even if you don't buy that you win social change, if you believe that social change is a deadlock in the debate, we at least win on safety, which is the most important. So we told you how we, number 1, prevent the most proximate harm towards individuals. Number 2, prevent the most certain harm which is likely to accrue the point which are further radicalized. And most importantly, we told you why we don't further disenfranchise vulnerable individuals within the same movement from their voices necessarily being drowned out. The point in which you have an overwhelming populist individual who takes control of the movement and uses the banner statement of self-expression to hide the true malicious nefarious affairs. So proud to propose.